This is WXOJLP Northampton, 103.3 FM, your Valley Free radio station. Welcome. I'm Warren Odess-Gillette, and this is A Baha'i Perspective. A Baha'i Perspective is a radio program that presents a Baha'i perspective on life through interviews. If you want information specifically on the Baha'i faith, you're welcome to visit the website www.baha'i.org. That's BAHAI.org. Or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE. Today I'm playing a telephone interview with Susan Maneck, a Baha'i who holds a master's degree in Oriental Studies and a PhD in history. She is currently an associate professor of history at Jackson State University in Mississippi. I started the interview by asking Susan where she grew up and what was it like growing up there.
I guess I was born in the Silicon Valley back when it was known for prune orchards, which is Santa Clara, California, in other words. We ate the prunes on the way to school back then, or plums, I guess. They weren't quite wrinkled yet. But in any case, I moved quite a bit, but mostly just around Northern California. And finally, my parents settled down more or less in Roseville, California, which is about 15 miles northeast of Sacramento, and that's where I went to middle school and high school. Mm-hmm. My father had a drinking problem at the time, but I was raised pretty much, I guess you could say, liberal Christian, congregational, and later on Presbyterian. Mm-hmm. I was a pretty avid reader of the Bible. I would say I probably read the New Testament perhaps 4 times, I think, before I became a Baha'i. Now, the Old Testament, now mind you, I became a Baha'i when I was 15. Mm-hmm. And the Old Testament took a little longer. Numbers takes a while. You have to be very dedicated to plow through Numbers, quite frankly.
So how old were you when you first read the Bible?
Oh, well, I read the entire Bible when I was 18, the Old Testament. The New Testament I read probably the first time when I was maybe 11, which is kind of interesting because my parents were not that much Bible readers. Of course, we had Bibles around the house, but I don't have much in the way of memories of them reading from it. I think I can remember one instance around Christmas time where they may have read the New Testament, the story of Jesus' nativity from the Bible at one point. But mostly Bibles were something you did at church. But my brother and I actually had much more interest in it than my parents did.
And what do you think accounted for the interest in the Bible?
Well, at the time, my brother was thinking about becoming a minister, and I was sort of imitating everything that my brother did. But within a year, he had sort of become an atheist. He was about 2 years older than I was, mind you. And I did not at that point. I remained interested in religion. But I think when I was about 12 years old, I was perhaps a little bit more interested in politics. I didn't think Christianity certainly was something that could change the world. And so I was very interested in the 1968 elections. Well, unfortunately, my hero was Robert Kennedy. And we know what happened to him.
Right.
And I was actually pretty devastated at the time.
And you were 11 or so?
I was 12 by then. I was 12 years old, and I remember I went into a deep depression that lasted, several months. I think he was assassinated in June, and but around August, my parents made the decision that they were going to send me to a Presbyterian summer camp for a week, which I objected to no end, because I had always been a nerd. I was the kind of kid that had the sign that said, "Kick me" on the back.
Yeah, sure.
And I was used to being picked on, and summer camp seemed like a very threatening environment to me. But as it turned out, the church camp was wonderful, and I found the people very accepting, and I very much felt bad about going back. And I remember on the last day of the camp, I took off on my own and went to a chapel that we had hiked to some time ago. Mm-hmm. And I walked up there, and it was all locked. And I was so disappointed that it was locked. I was determined I was going to get inside that place. Mm-hmm. And I walked along the molding, and I must have been about 15 feet up off the ground to get in through the window. I don't know what had possessed me, because I was not a climber at all, and I was not the sort of person who normally took risks. Right. But in fact, and I don't know why that molding told me, it was not even a proper ledge. Right. But somehow I got inside, and I said a prayer that somehow I would be able to return to that place, and
what place?
Well, it was Presbyterian Pine Summer Camp.
Okay, so the camp. You were praying that you'd come back to the camp.
This was the camp, and I wanted to come back to that place because of the way it felt. Well, as it turned out, I did. The following fall, well, not the following fall, but the fall when I began high school, I guess it was about a little over a year, there was a summer youth retreat that our church was having, and so I went with the high school kids. Well, mind you, I was a year younger, and like I said, never one terribly easily able to fit in. And so that was my prime concern at the time.
Right.
And
even though you'd been to the camp before?
I'd been to that camp, but of course this was the kids from our own church, which was a tad different. Okay. And I remember there was a bunch of us gathered in the cabin after the chaperones left, and then the drugs came out.
Oh, my God.
And I looked around at the other kids, and I was trying to decide what to do, because suddenly the price of fitting in was getting a little high. And there was a Hispanic girl, the only non-white girl in the group. And she looked over at me, and her eyes looked towards the door. And so I slipped out with her.
Oh, that's sweet.
And we went off to a cabin by ourselves, and that's when she told me about the Baha'i faith.
Really?
Yes.
Was she a Baha'i?
She was a Baha'i, and she was guest of the minister. Her brother, who was also a Baha'i, was the little brother, and the minister actually was the big brother then for Big Brother's organization.
I see.
And so that's how those two had ended up at the camp.
Wow.
At first, I wasn't terribly interested. I mean, I loved Loopy. And I certainly felt like here, finally, I was going to have a best friend. Yeah. And that is the way it was, indeed, through all my years of high school. Yeah. From then on. But when she told me about the Baha'i faith, she said the Baha'i faith believes all religions are one. And my immediate response to that was, well, that's good. I'll keep my own. Loopy had a certain beauty to her. Actually, I would say in a lot of ways, she articulated very well what she thought. I mean, her response when I said, I'll keep what I have, was, well, that's beautiful. She knew better than to argue.
Oh, that's sweet.
But, you know, after we went back to Roseville, there was a day when the football game got rained out, so I called Loopy up, and I'll say, let's go to one of those firesides you've always been talking about.
A fireside being what?
Being one of the sort of informal meetings that Baha'is had, but of course at the time I thought maybe it was some kind of seance. You know, I had this images of fire, well, not so much a seance, but you know, that there was a big fire and everybody was sitting around auming or something.
What moved you to ask her to go, or for you to ask her to go with you to a fireside?
Pure curiosity.
I see.
Pure curiosity at the time.
Sure.
And of course, all it was a very informal meeting in somebody's living room, but the living room was jam-packed, and there was a lot of young people there, and back in those days, almost every Baha'i came equipped with a guitar, so there was lots of singing. And I remember at that fireside, somebody told me the story of the Bab.
And what story was that?
You know, the Bab was the Baha'u'llah's forerunner. And his ministry was very short, like Jesus's. It was, well, a little longer than Jesus. It was about 6 years. And most of it was spent in prison. He would go be sent from one prison to the other, end up getting transferred a lot, mostly because he would convert his guards and the warden and whatnot, so then they'd move him on to another prison. But eventually they ordered his execution because the Bab was claiming to be the 12th Imam of Shiite Islam, the Mahdi. That's what they would call their promised one. And just like just like Jews expected their Messiah to be kind of a 5-star general who would rescue the Jews from either captivity or domination by another country, so Muslims saw their Mahdi as being someone who would conquer all of their enemies. And so that's what they were expecting of their Mahdi. And here along comes the Bab, and he's a very meek man, and not at all militaristic. And instead he's teaching unity and things like this. And so they ordered his execution. Okay? And initially, they sent out a Christian regiment to do the job. Because, the Bab was a descendant from the Prophet Muhammad, and those people were usually treated with a great deal of respect, so Muslims would not have wanted to execute him. And so they sent out this regiment of men, but the Christians weren't terribly enthusiastic about executing the Bab, too. He was a very, like I said, mild-mannered man. And finally Sam Khan came and he says, he was the head of the regiment. He says, I don't have any ill will towards you, and I don't really even want to carry this out. And the Bab said, well, just carry out your orders, and if your intentions are sincere, it's all going to work out. When they came to get the Bab, however, he was busy talking to his secretary and giving him some last-minute instructions. And he said, well, let me finish giving these instructions. And they weren't prepared to do that. And they took him off anyhow to be executed, along with one of his followers, a 17-year-old boy named Anis. And they were all sort of strung up. Anis was rested upon the Bab's breast. The order was given to fire. Now, of course, they were using those old-style muskets, which raise up a lot of smoke. And 750 muskets, you can imagine the amount of smoke they raised up. Well, when the smoke cleared, the Bab was gone, and this boy was standing there unharmed. And they went to search for them, and they found him back in the barracks completing his conversation with his secretary. And he said, okay, I'm ready to go now. Well, Sam Khan was not about ready to have his regiment fire a second time. He marched them off, and they had to bring out a Muslim regiment to complete the job. And this time, the Bab and Anis were strung up again in the same fashion. The bullets fired, and with so much force that the bodies of the two men really could not be separated from one another. And they rest together today at the Shrine of the Bab, which is located on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel.
What year was this?
Oh, this would have been in 1850. 1850. Well, anyhow, I heard that story, and I was enthralled. And I said, give me a book on the Bab. And they tried to give me a book entitled Thief in the Night, and I said, is this about the Bab? And they said, well, these are prophecies related to Baha'u'llah, who's the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. And I said, I can't even pronounce his name. Give me a book on the Bab. So they gave me Release the Sun, by the same author, by the way.
Okay.
And I took that book home. I read it in 2 days, and then I came back the next week, and I said, okay, you can tell me about the other dude. And I think
what was going on in your mind at the time after you read that book?
Well, I remember when I came home from the fireside, The next morning, I was standing in front of the furnace getting warm, and my mother came by, and she said, well, how did that meeting you went to go? And I said, it's interesting, Mom. Those people think Christ has returned. And she said, bunch of nuts, huh? And I said, I haven't decided. And she said, what? But the thing that impressed me about Release the Sun is that when I compared it to the life of Christ, what I'd read about him in the Gospels, it seemed to me it was telling the same story. How could I say that this story of the Bob and his life and his station wasn't true, and then turn around and say the Gospels were true? To me, in my own mind, either they both had to be true or they both had to be false. Because ultimately, anything that you believe to be the Word of God, it's because when you hear it, you hear God speak to you somehow. And that story really touched my heart. That book really touched my heart in the same way the Gospels had. And I really couldn't deny one without also denying the other. And so I started reading a book a week, I think, for the next year and a half before I finally became a Baha'i when I was 15. But
and what was it that after a year and a half moved you to actually declare yourself as a Baha'i?
Well, it was turning 15.
I see. Can you explain that?
Yeah, in the Baha'i faith, for Baha'i, 15 is the age of maturity, okay? And so that's really the time in which Baha'is expect people to make an independent decision on their own. So they wouldn't have accepted, at least at that time, they would not have accepted a declaration from me if I'd only been 13 or 14 years old. They would have said, you need to think on this a while. It's not time to sort of choose your own religion just yet.
Right. Yeah.
That's really, Baha'i children are pretty much expected whether they're going to follow the religion of their parents or do something else at that point. That's really when we consider people responsible for their own decisions. And, of course, one of the most important principles of the Baha'i faith is the independent investigation of truth. As Baha'u'llah says, that we should see with our own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and know of our own knowledge and not through the knowledge of others. And most of us try to cultivate that sense.
Sure.
That's why we don't have any priesthood in the Baha'i faith.
Okay. So what happened after you became a Baha'i?
Well, that was a bit traumatic. My father, I think I mentioned that my father had a drinking problem. And he sort of took my interest in the faith as kind of he interpreted it as a rejection of him and a rejection of Jesus because he had to set a good example. Of course, it wasn't anything like that at all. I love Jesus. I never stopped loving Jesus. But when I looked at the Bob, I saw Jesus. So what could I do? And but that's not the way he took it. And I delayed becoming a Baha'i a little bit past the time I was 15 because, well, he went out drinking one Thanksgiving evening, night before Thanksgiving, and he wrapped the car around the tree, and he got very serious brain damage from it.
Oh, boy.
And was hospitalized for quite some time. And, when he finally came home, it wasn't just, we didn't know about the brain damage just then. My mother actually had asked me to let my father have a chance to recover before I made any decisions in that direction, and I had agreed to do that. But when she went away one weekend, my father started drinking again. And there were some problems that developed, and I ended up having to leave the house, and I took his keys with me so my father wouldn't be able to drive in his drunken stage. And the only place I could really take refuge, I guess, was with the Baha'is. And I did that weekend. I declared because I figured, well, after I did this, my parents aren't going to let me have anything to do with the Baha'is anyhow. As it turned out, but actually my non-Baha'i brother, he had helped me sort of get away because I really needed to get out of that situation.
Now, did your brother ever, just to diverge a little bit, did your brother actually ever leave being change from being an atheist?
Well, he said some prayers when he was dying. Sometimes, Baha'u'llah says no man knows what happens at the hour of his death, so who knows whether,
but up to
something
that time,
inside of his heart had changed or not, but he was pretty much of a lifelong atheist, I guess you could say.
Right.
But in any case...
so back to your story.
Yeah. Well, when I came home, my father sort of lost it, and he actually went after me, but my brother got between us two. But he was acting irrational enough that my mother found it necessary to take him to the mental hospital. And while he was hospitalized, they found that he had epilepsy.
Oh, boy.
And when he came home, he was having seizures just about daily. And actually, I ended up staying home with him a great deal of the time because he really couldn't be left alone in that condition. And I was correct. My parents weren't letting me have any contact with the Baha'is, and in fact, I wasn't able to contact them for the next year and a half. And in the meantime, my father was having epilepsy. He was deeply depressed and constantly crying about why did I do this to him. And, so I was sort of being overwhelmed. Of course, intellectually, I knew better. But still, emotionally, those things always take their toll. On the other hand, perhaps sometimes when you pay that high a price for something like that, it becomes even more important to you.
Sure.
And I know I would order Baha'i books, and I'd have them mailed, or I'd go to the library. I read everything under the sun that I could possibly read during that period of time. And, eventually they did start allowing me to see the Baha'is, partly because they knew I'd be leaving home soon, and I don't think they wanted me completely alienated.
Did they notice anything different about you?
I don't know. You see, I was always the kid who never made much trouble anyhow, I guess.
Sure.
But they certainly must have known. I know that my mother acknowledges, because since all of my brothers and sisters had alcohol and drug problems, and I did not, I think, and also, my sister got pregnant before she finished high school and things like that. I think there certainly was an acknowledgement that the Baha'i faith had kept me away from those kinds of things. But of course, I really had become a Baha'i so young that I wasn't yet into them.
Sure.
But as you know, as the story I told you indicates, there was that choice that was made way back when I was 13 years old in that room in Presbyterian Pines.
Yes, right.
I guess in some ways that choice has always remained with me.
So then you finally moved out?
Well, I went away to college when I was 17.
Okay.
And I went to UC Santa Cruz, which was sort of the most liberal university of the UC system at the time. I like to say that's where Berkeley liked to send its eccentrics. Still, Santa Cruz is a place that's kind of trapped in 1968. So for those of us who like 1968, it's a nice place to go to. And I still very much love that place. And that's where I did my undergraduate work. I ended up getting my bachelor's in religious studies, primarily comparative religion.
And then you went on to graduate school?
A little bit. I went back and I lived with my parents for a few years, taught a little bit in the daycare centers, and special ed in the Hayward Unified School District, and then I went. My parents were living in Castro Valley by then. I should add, in California, and then I went to graduate school in Arizona.
Okay.
And that's where I did my master's degree. I did my graduate work. I did my master's degree in Oriental Studies, and where I wrote my master's thesis on Zoroastrian conversions to Baha'i faith in Iran, 1880 to 1920. I broke new ground.
Yeah. So.
And but I wasn't intending to. But I got my PhD in history, and I wrote my dissertation on Zoroastrianism, as a matter of fact.
Okay. So what aspect of Zoroastrians converting to the Baha'i faith was it just sort of quantifying statistically, or what was...
No. I was able to get a hold of people's stories, and one of the things that I was most interested in looking at was the gradualness of conversion, in the sense that, well, people might accept Baha'u'llah. For a long time they continued to practice as Zoroastrians. They would carry out the ceremonies, but very gradually they began to change some of these. They began to, and in some cases they changed the entire Zoroastrian community with them. For instance, in Yazd, the practice was, amongst the Zoroastrian community, was to leave their dead in what's called dakhmes, or towers of silence, where they would be consumed by birds. And Baha'is bury their dead. Zoroastrians don't like to do that because they consider that polluting the earth. Because they regard anything that's dead as polluting. And so the Baha'is, Zoroastrian Baha'is, first started encasing people in cement so that they could bury them, but they really ended up persuading the rest of the Zoroastrian community to follow suit. And to this day, the Zoroastrians in Iran, by and large, prefer to bury their dead.
Interesting.
To using those towers of silence. They also ended up establishing the school systems. Actually, the school systems were set up by the Parsis, but Baha'is ended up being the bulk of the teachers.
No, Parsis?
Yeah, the Parsis are the Zoroastrians who were from India.
Okay.
And, of course, the Yazd is a town in southern Iran. And India and Iran are really about the only two places in the world that still have Zoroastrians there. And actually what I was looking at, when I first started work on my master's thesis, it was going to be much broader. It was going to address the issue of how was it that non-Muslims started becoming Baha'is in Iran. And I was interested in that issue because, what is it that, it's part of the question of what is it that makes the Baha'i faith an independent religion? Because if the only people they're converting are Muslims, it's effectively a sect of Islam.
Right.
But once you have Jews and you have Zoroastrians, and at that point there were very few Christians in Iran that were becoming Baha'is, but lots of Jews and lots of Zoroastrians, then it really, can be seen as an independent religion. Because Zoroastrians and Jews were not going to become Muslims.
Yeah.
But
and the reason being?
Well, because they were so badly treated by Muslims, it was not going to be something that would attract them. In fact, one of the stories that I found, and I found this in both the Jewish and Zoroastrian accounts of how it is that people became Baha'i, is that Baha'is, often of Muslim background, might invite a Jew or a Zoroastrian to their home and serve them tea. And normally, in those days, if a Muslim served a Jew or a Zoroastrian tea, after they drank it, they would break the cup because they considered them polluting, and they wouldn't want to use that cup again. But what the Baha'is would do is they would serve them tea, and then after they drank it, they'd pour tea for themselves and drink out of the same cup without washing it. Now, I don't know how sanitary that was.
Yeah, but it spoke a lot.
But it was a way of saying, you are not polluting to me.
Right, sure.
And I think it was a very, very powerful message. The fact that I find it in both the Baha'i and non-Baha'i accounts shows me that the fact that the Baha'is were so intent on, as Baha'u'llah put it, consorting with the followers of all religions with joy and spirituality, that impressed people that were living in a culture that did not seem all that tolerant of them, because they used to have to, they couldn't touch food in the marketplace. They were subjected to all of these things because they were regarded as unclean.
Right. And then you got your doctorate?
Yes, I got my doctorate, and I was a gypsy professor for a number of years and too many localities to recount. I'm presently associate professor at Jackson State University in Mississippi, which is a long ways from California.
Yeah, I'd say so. And what are you teaching there?
Well, I'm in the history and philosophy department. By the way, religion tends to be taught there as well. And I'll teach Middle East history. I teach South Asian history. I teach the world religions class typically. Our bread and butter is, of course, world history. And to me, in some ways, that's the most important course because, the most important thing I think I want to do as a Baha'i professor is to impress upon people the unity of humanity. And I can't think of a better way of doing that than teaching world history.
Sure. Now, I understand you know Arabic?
I have studied Arabic for 2 years. Okay. I have studied both Arabic and Persian. My Persian is somewhat better than my Arabic. Arabic is an exceedingly difficult language, but I do have at least some, and I have a little bit more Persian. And Persian was primarily my language of research.
While you were doing your doctorate? Or your master's?
For my dissertation, I needed to use Persian language sources, even though it was on the Zoroastrians of India. During the period I was studying, a lot of them were writing in Persian.
What does the future hold for you, Susan?
Well, that's always a big question.
Sure.
I go for tenure next year, so maybe next year would be a good time to ask me that question.
Right. Is that the point you can request a sabbatical once you're tenured?
You can, but sabbaticals are few and far between at Jackson State University. You know, this is a historically black college without a lot of funds. And they have some sabbatical money, but not much. And it's very competitive to try to get the sabbaticals. Most professors never, in fact, get them.
So what's your experience as a European-American teaching in a predominantly African-American environment?
Well, first thing you have to understand is that if you come from California, the entire South is a foreign country, to which you'll never quite be a native to, no matter how many years you live here. At first, I had some difficulties because some of my students were just so ill-prepared for work on the college level. But what I learned eventually was to break it up into smaller pieces. I helped design a workbook to go with our textbook that would help assist students get them there, so that hopefully then, and then working on the writing skills and things like that in order to express it. And eventually, I began to feel quite comfortable. I live in a predominantly African-American neighborhood as well. And I guess I've pretty much eased in here. Yeah,
so you see the effect. So you see the effects of the inequality of the education system between white suburbia and the inner urban centers.
To a certain extent, although one thing you need to understand is that the entire education system in Mississippi tends to be lacking somewhat. And the private schools that were often set up for white kids to go to, so they wouldn't have to desegregate. In fact, the products of those schools do not get any higher test scores than my students. So it does seem to be kind of a across-the-board problem within this state. So it may be part of the regional inequities as well. It's real vital. I think that I'm always thinking about the necessity to sort of reach my students because, well, especially when you talk about the African American males, if they don't get a college education, there's like a 50% chance they're going to end up in jail or on drugs or something undesirable. So it becomes really vital to be able to reach them because they're not going to find it very easy to get a future, especially in this state, without a decent education.
Are you doing any writing?
Yes, you mean besides internet posts.
Although I do find your internet posts quite interesting.
Well, I'm in the process
Actually,
of writing.
maybe before we go into that, maybe we should just describe a little bit about the listserv you're talking about.
It's a Yahoo group, it's Baha'i, B-A-H-I, what do you call it, underscore, community, as one of the Yahoo groups. And it's a fairly large group right now. We have about 650 members, I think. And we're having some very interesting dialogues between Christians and Baha'is, which I think have been very cordial for the most part. And certainly, I think we would certainly welcome more of that. Actually, I run a number of Baha'i lists, and Baha'i Community was just sort of the latest one that I just happened to start. Well, I didn't start it. Somebody else started it and then put it in my lap. So I've been carrying it forward since.
I see. So aside from listservs, what are you writing? Or posts on listservs?
Well, I am planning to write something on Baha'i conceptions of religion and state. And, well, not so much Baha'i perspectives. I'm looking at what Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha were saying about the relationship between religion and state from the standpoint of Islamic ideals.
Now, who's
in other words,
Abdu'l-Baha?
what were they saying within that context, which I think has been missed in some of the other scholarship that's been done on that subject. Too many of them have tried to frame it in the Western terms of church and state. Well, there isn't a church in the Baha'i faith. In the sense of an ecclesiastical structure. As I said, we don't have a priesthood.
Right.
There isn't one.
Who's Abdu'l-Baha?
Now, Abdu'l-Baha was the son of Baha'u'llah.
I see.
And Baha'is regard him really as the perfect exemplar of the Baha'i teachings, as the authorized interpreter of his writings. And he lived, well, he died in 1921, I guess. I guess he headed the faith for roughly about 30 years. He was instrumental in bringing the faith to the United States. He visited the United States himself when he was in about 1912, and traveled the length and the breadth of the country, speaking to various organizations and whatnot there. And what I'm suggesting is that what Baha'u'llah did when he established houses of justice, we call most of those local and national spiritual assemblies at the time. Let me put it this way.
These local spiritual assemblies, these are local governing bodies for the Baha'is?
Yes, these are local governing bodies. But briefly, the Islamic conception is that you can't have democratic legislatures because law is something that's divinely revealed. And you can have elected leaders, Okay, the consensus of the community can pick their leader, but the leader's job is to enforce the Sharia, the Islamic law that's already been laid out, and usually interpreted by the clergy. What Baha'u'llah did was he set up legislatures, whether we call them houses of justice or spiritual assemblies, but I guess added a sacral dimension to them. That the very the kind of consultative process by which Baha'is go about making decisions is seen as containing a sense of divine inspiration in it, I guess is probably the best way of putting it. So that it's democratic on the one hand, but without losing that sacred quality that I guess Islamic law had.
Now, speaking of Islamic law and the fact that you said something about something about Islam and democracy, can you repeat that again?
Well, what I was saying is that at least prior to the 20th century, I should say the 20th century, that's changed because countries like Iran do have legislatures.
Okay.
But originally, the very concept of a legislature on the model of Western democracies was unthinkable because law was seen as something that was divinely revealed, not something that was man-made, and therefore you could have it made by legislatures.
Yeah.
And therefore, they did have a concept that you could democratically elect a leader, but not that you would make laws that way. And like I said, that has changed because you now have Islamic republics, Iran being one, Pakistan being another.
Although Pakistan's somewhat of a dictatorship, I don't know how much legislative power there is with Musharraf there.
Well, it goes back and forth. I use those two examples because those are the two states which explicitly call themselves Islamic republics.
Okay. Now, go ahead.
For instance, in Iran, you have a legislature, but
Right.
mind you have the ulama have authority to veto any of the legislature that goes through
Right.
if they think it's contrary to Islamic law. And you can't run for the Iranian legislature unless you've been approved by these ulama. So it's not an entirely open system, but I think it's probably fair to say that it is a republic in some sense of the word.
Actually, my wife and I were having this conversation about what's the difference between the definition of republic and democracy?
Okay. Yes, that goes back to sort of middle school civics class.
Yeah.
But the basic difference is that a republic is governed chiefly by constitution. And whereas a democracy is what the majority says goes. Technically speaking, the United States is a republic. It is not a democracy. For instance, we have safeguards in our Constitution which prevent the majority from tyrannizing minorities. In theory.
Right.
And sometimes even in practice.
Right.
And so there are limits to even what the majority can vote for. And so a republic would be basically any system, but I would assume that, generally speaking, a republic is going to have some kind of a legislative, executive, and judicial arm to it, just as we commonly find in the West. Such was not typical in the East, however, and in the Islamic world. You had the executive, and then you had the ulama who acted both as judges and determined what was the content of Islamic law. So they had a tremendous amount of power. And a lot of what Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha said and the powers they gave to houses of justice was an attempt to diminish the power of the Muslim clerics, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
or any clerics. In other words, I guess it's perhaps more precisely to prevent that same kind of power structure from being developed in the Baha'i faith.
Yeah, actually, Baha'u'llah said something about how the clerics, in a lot of cases, and not just in Islamic relationship with the Baha'i faith, but in pretty much every revealed religion, to some degree, the clerics were the ones that sort of were the impasse between people and the messenger of God appearing at that time. And I guess Baha'u'llah was trying to address that by removing that barrier.
Sure, that's why, for instance, the New Testament talks so much about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and things like that. They pretty much played the same function within the Jewish community as the ulama tend to play in Islam. And any time that there's just simply one truth about religion. Let's face it, it's true about all religions. No religion wants to be superseded. And if you have a professional investment in a religion taking a certain form, that's what you're making your living off of. Anyone who comes along and tries to change any of that is going to be a threat.
Yeah.
I don't know that clerics are any more naturally perverse than anybody else, but in some sense they have people's souls in their hands.
Yeah.
Now, that only happens because we give them that kind of power. In other words, we don't exercise our own ability to search for the truth for ourselves, and we rely on these people that we imagine to be experts.
Yeah. Now, what do you think accounted for the fact that Islam moved toward a republic or democratically elected legislature from the past?
Well, there was a long debate about it. And in many cases, it was justified on the principles of things like consultation. Of course, consultation is extremely important to Baha'is as well. A lot of Baha'is don't realize that's to be found in Islam, too. I think Abdul-Baha perhaps worked out ideas of consultation a little bit more and talked about how consultation should take place. But it really, the first justification for it were Quranic verses. And, of course, the first justifications aren't written until the 19th century when people are looking at the West and saying, what can we borrow from them and what can't we? And the notion that rulers ought to consult with the people is a large part of that. Abdul-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son, participated in these discussions.
With his Muslim friends?
He wrote a book called The Secret of Divine Civilization, which you may be familiar with, which is written in a whole genre of literature that was being produced at the time of how do we deal with the West. And, of course, what Abdul-Baha was arguing is that we shouldn't be resisting modernization simply because it's not necessarily coming out of our religion or out of our culture and things like that. And he would quote a famous hadith of Muhammad seeking knowledge even under China and things like that. And so he was willing to acknowledge the contributions of the West. At the same time, he recognized how much of them actually were the result of Islamic influence. That the introduction of knowledge from the Islamic West is really what allowed universities eventually just to develop in Europe. Scholasticism was developed first in the Islamic world and then was carried on, as were universities. And then later on they developed in Europe, and much of our knowledge of Greek philosophy, nearly all of it, in fact, came from the Islamic world as well. So, Abdul-Baha could also see the debt to it. But he was saying, it's like the Islamic world had at some point in its history become frozen in time, and it was we needed to move on,
Right.
I guess.
Now, you mentioned something about the Baha'i principle and consultation. Can you explain a little bit of what that means?
Well, when Baha'is try to arrive at decisions, we use what's known as the consultative process. In other words, everyone needs to be in a position where they're free to express their opinion, but then it doesn't belong to them anymore. It belongs to the group. Mm-hmm. And so we need to have a certain amount of attachment. At the same time, we can't get hurt by people who have opposing opinions. We all need to contribute our own perspective and really sort of let the Spirit work through us. Mm-hmm. And if we can do that with enough detachment, then the decisions that come out of that can be inspired, if you will. They become more than simply the sum of our parts, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, Susan, thank you very much.
And my phone has lasted, has it not?
Yeah, that's awesome. Divine intervention.
Okay. All right, great. Okay. I will see you online then, huh?
Yeah, I'll see you on our next post.
Okay, great.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Susan Maneck, a Baha'i and associate professor of history at Jackson State University in Mississippi. For a copy of this and other interviews, you can go to the website www.abahaiperspective.com. For information specifically on the Baha'i Faith, you can go to the website www.baha'i.org, or you can call the toll-free number 1-800-22-UNITE.